Good afternoon. Welcome to the second session of our symposium, Seizing the Sky, Redefining American Art, the work of Kay WalkingStick. My name is David Penney. I'm the Associate Director for Museum Scholarship here at the National Museum of American Indian. And first, let me just acknowledge my brilliant partner and co-curator for the exhibition you see upstairs, Kathleen Ash-Bilby. She just did a fantastic job. When we thought about this session and we considered really the brilliant selection of, or we shouldn't think it was such a brilliant selection, but it was certainly an assortment of brilliant people that we invited to come down and speak for us here in Washington on this occasion. We roughly divided up the topic into what we thought was the earlier session would be sort of focused on Kay's practice, and the second session would be focused on the larger context of Kay's work in art history, society, and culture in the late 20th and early 21st century. But I think as you noted in our first session, and you'll certainly see here, that Kay's practice, her very personal approach, the way she approaches making art, and the larger world of art and art history and society, those interweave consistently throughout her work and practice, and we can see it in the paintings. And you'll note again, even in the comments in the second session, how her work and her particular approach kind of also intersects with these larger art historical and cultural concerns. Kay always likes to say that she's a visual person, and of course, she is very much so. But that, in a sense, is kind of selling her short, because she's also a fiercely intellectual person, and not an intellectual person in the sense of being didactic or lecturing, but someone who really thinks deeply about her practice, and also is very adept at talking about it. So that what you're hearing today, and certainly what I've benefited from, are long and really heartfelt conversations between her and the panelists, the speakers that you're hearing today. And we're really grateful for the generosity of your mind and your generosity of your practice, Kay, and including us all in this. I know, and I don't mean to embarrass you. This must be awfully hard, to sit and listen to all these nice things. We'll think of something not so nice to say, and maybe you'll feel better. But anyway, we're really very grateful you're here. So before I'm going to call up each speaker individually. I'll introduce them. But before I do, of course, the housekeeping things about, if you have a cell phone, please take this opportunity to turn it off. We are recording this program on webcast and broadcasting it. We will have a question and answer period afterwards, so hold your questions, and please think about some questions, some things you'd like to ask. We'll have that at the end of our session. I'll invite our speakers this afternoon for the second section back up on the stage to sit at the table and have a further discussion. But let me start then by introducing our first speaker for this afternoon, Jolene Rickard, who is an associate professor in the history of art at the art department at Cornell University. I've known Jolene for quite a long time, and I'm really very, very grateful that she agreed to come down and participate. She is a visual historian, an artist, a curator interested in issues of indigeneity with a global context, and she's really thought deeply about many of the issues that she'll be addressing today, and we're really very lucky to have her here to speak with us. Jolene, if you'd come up, please.
Okay. Good afternoon, Twa Askanaha in the Tuscarora language. I'd like to thank you for, Twa Askanaha in the Tuscarora language. I'd like to thank you for taking the time this afternoon to spend some time with us. I'd like to thank both Kathleen and David for the work they continue to do here at the Smithsonian, but mostly I'd like to thank Kay WalkingStick. Say nyawa to her for her strength, for her integrity, and for her determination. And I'd like to say that the panelists this morning did a lot of heavy lifting, and it allows me the opportunity to bring some anecdotal comment into the discussion about the place of Kay WalkingStick's work in relationship to the ongoing and growing discourse of the field of not only Native American art history, but also the field of Indigenous studies at large. When Kay began working, there really wasn't even a discussion of the field of Indigenous studies. And at this period of time, we've seen the discourse of Indigenous studies blossom into a very rigorous site of analysis. And so my work is at the intersection of considering where does Indigenous art fit in relationship to the broader discourse of Indigenous art, of indigeneity, and also the field of global thought, the broader discourse of all of the ideas that are circulating in the world today around culture and formation. On a personal note, I'd like to thank Kay for the warm welcome that she gave me by extending an invitation for a lecture long before I was considering employment at Cornell. She welcomed me to her home, along with two ladies from Tuscarora that used to travel with me when I left Tuscarora to go and do a lecture. Dorothy Printup and Dolly Winden, who are no longer with us, drove out to Ithaca from Tuscarora with me one day. I did a little talk, and Kay welcomed us to our home. And she made us this amazing lasagna dinner with a beautiful salad with candlelights and lots of nice wine. And I bet you I'm the only person in the room that's actually had that particular delight. But thank you, Kay, for her level of hospitality is probably untouched. And so some of the things that I'm thinking about that I'd like to maybe, I'm not saying that I'm pushing back on this idea, but one of the things that I've been thinking about for quite some time is, as an Indigenous person, what is our relationship to this construct of landscape, in particular, the category of landscape as it's discussed within the field of art history. Because it's my understanding that this category, the way in which landscape is expressed, is actually a visualization of the dispossession of our land as Indigenous peoples in the Americas. And so I'm questioning our relationship to this broader category, how we engage it while at the same time making an intervention on it. And I say this because the dispossession of our lands isn't over. It's still ongoing. And why do I say this? Because I have an example less than 40 minutes from where I live in Ithaca at the current time. And so Kate and I share an interesting experience. I have the advantage of having had the opportunity to look at this amazing book, this amazing catalog that's been produced on her work and this long trajectory. It gave me a moment to reflect on something that I quite hadn't realized before. And it goes something like this. Kay grew up in the same region that I'm living in right now. And so she spent a great deal of time actually in Haudenosaunee territories. And so what does this mean in relationship to this larger discourse of Cherokee, this larger discourse of America? And so I want to float an idea to you in that within the history of the Tuscarora people, we understand that at one period of time, we were all part of the northern family of Haudenosaunee people, located along the Finger Lake region in upstate, what you would call upstate New York. But according to the Tuscarora Migration oral history, which has been recorded and documented by Cusick, by Hewitt, by Anthony Wallace, we have a migration story that takes us from upstate New York takes us all the way through the Three River Junction near today what would be the Pittsburgh area, down through the Ohio-Mississippi area, arcing back around to the Carolinas. In that story, we talk about we left cousins behind. And part of the cousins that we left behind are the Cherokee people at that period of time. And so linguists will tell you that our languages are actually very close, that we belong to the same cultural families. And so I'm interested in a lateral look at Kay WalkingStick's work. I'm looking at her work from the perspective of a Haudenosaunee, a Tuscarora woman, a person deeply invested in understanding that culture is our intellectual engine in Indigenous thought. And what does it mean in relationship to now Kay WalkingStick's work from an Indigenous perspective? And so when I think about the migration story, and I think that as a Tuscarora for 1,000 years, we lived as neighbors, sometimes contentious neighbors, in the southeast region. And then the Tuscarora, we were forcibly displaced. Our displacement has not been canonized as a trail of tears, but in fact it wasn't anything different than that. And so on that level, our people share a very similar history. And so the migration or the reverse dispossession of Tuscaroras back up to the homelands in what is now the New York State region has forced me to think about our relationship to place. And I would extend this idea as a way of thinking about perhaps Indigenous peoples and our relationship to place at large, in that we can't think of our only relationship to a single piece of land or a single location that has been defined by the post or the reservation period. One of the most empowering ideas that was shared with me last year by Tanya Ganella-Frischner, who's no longer with us, we would say Gaha. She said that the range of the Haudenosaunee went from the southern tip of North Carolina all the way up to the Georgian Bay, all the way over to the East Coast and as far as the Mississippi. That was our range. Most Indigenous peoples in the Americas have similar mappings and ranges because we use land not in fixed locations, but we use land in a way we had multiple use of land, and so we were constantly in movement. And so that's the work of Kay WalkingStick. Her relationship to place is one of constant movement. But I think this piece that I selected, The Death of the Elm, also coincides with a kind of consciousness that America was coming to about the impact of degradation to the environment, because the elm was one of the first signifiers, in particular in the region or the biome that we are in the Northeast, as the fact that something's happening with the trees. And it's also part of the prophecies, because they said there will come a period of time when the trees will die from the top down. And so I wonder if, as a Tuscarora, if as a Cayuga, if as an Onondaga, or if as a Cherokee, in the future, we will look back at Kay's work and see it in a way perhaps that we're not discussing it today, or perhaps a way that the artist didn't intend. And so there's prophecy in Kay's work, prophecy that hasn't been fully articulated, and it usually takes time to have that distance and perspective in an artist's work. And so at the same moment, I just wanted to include another person who was working in the same region, and this is the work of a Seneca artist named Ernest Smith. And this is the way he visualized this relationship to prophecy. And it was called The Warning. It's the story of the white beaver telling us about a time when the environment around us will not be well, and we'll have to change our ways in order to fix it. And so I wanted to share with you, this is actually a map of the region that Kay spent a great deal of time in, and that I'm spending time in right now. Because so much of her work about landscape is a contemplation of place. And so this particular area, I'm having a very interesting relationship to it, and by taking a closer look at Kay's work, it helped me to think about a certain kind of profound dimension of the Cayuga homelands. And so when I saw this work and read the analysis of the abyss and understood where it was located in Kay's life, and then I saw it and I was thinking about, and I'm sure this is not appropriate, but I was thinking about just the overwhelming presence of Cornell on the land there. In that Cornell is the largest landowner in the state of New York. It's supposed to be a land-grant institution. And as the director of the American Indian Program, I struggle every day to help them to meet their ethical responsibility to that right. And so at the same period of time, I work very delicately to have a relationship with the Cayuga leaders who are struggling to reclaim the authority in their own homelands because they were dispossessed and have lost court cases in order to reclaim their right to their own homelands. And in this sense, the kinds of things they are teaching me about their land, about this place, coincides with an insight that Kay has in relationship to her focus on the gorges and water in Ithaca and around Cayuga Lake. And so, from a lateral perspective, in the future, a young Cayuga person may look at Kay's work and think about the violence that occurred against the Cayuga in that site, both by Hunut Degayus, George Washington, in his Burnt Earth campaign when the General Sullivan came through and eradicated the food stores, corn, something that is, of course, still a strategy of the military today, and that occurred on this land. But at the same period of time, the Cayuga are also having a very sustained relationship to what these waterfalls mean. And we're struggling to understand, in a sense, reclaim what is there. And I want to, because I am concerned about where this discussion fits globally, I have to share with you that the invitation to come here coincided with the same time that I was on my way to Venice. And I went to the American Pavilion and was very happy to see a woman artist of certainly a great acclaim, Joan Jonas, be featured in the American Pavilion. But Kay was in my mind at the same time. And I was thinking about Kay, and I was thinking about how, in a sense, it would have been, in my mind, Kay was there too. But what was interesting to me about just a tiny aspect, but is it tiny, of Joan Jonas's installation at the Venice Biennale, and it was her inclusion of the haunting voice of a Sami yoiker. Yoinking is a very ancient form of singing. But something else happened. The yoiker that is in Joan Jonas's installation, Ande Sambre and I were on the same panel. And he informed me that Joan Jonas used his work in the exhibit, and he talked about what yoiking is. And so yoiking is from the dream time. It's something that was generational in his family, and it's a dialogue that the Sami have with what many people in North America acknowledge as the little people. And so in European culture, they call them fairies. And so I thought it was interesting that this became something that was a thread, this sort of perhaps quest to re-enchant that took place in Joan Jonas's work. And I'm thinking about this in relationship to this broader category of the role of the indigenous in the world today. And so this is just a short clip, but I wanted to share the wolf with you, because Ande performs this particular yoik as a warning of what happens to a society that kills all of its wolf.
Luôn tới nỗi luôn nỗi luôn tới yêu luôn ơi luôn tới nỗi luôn đuổi lại ơi luôn tới yêu luôn ơi luôn tới ơi luôn yêu ơi luôn tới yêu hỏi là ơi luôn ơi là ơi luôn ơi luôn hey yo hey yo ơi luôn ơi là ơi luôn ôi là ơi luôn hey yo ôi là ơi luôn ôi là ơi luôn.
So I think we know what happens to a society that kills all its wolf. And so I was also struck by another indigenous insertion at the Venice Biennale this year. And it was in the work of Fiona Hall, a very well-known Australian artist. And it was her collaboration with the Jumpy weavers, in that each of these weavings represents an animal that's been impacted by nuclear fallout in their part of the world. And so this collaboration with the Jumpy weavers of the Australian Aboriginal peoples is another kind of haunting insertion in this event. And so what I'm thinking about is that this moment of Kay WalkingStick, this moment of featuring the artwork of this incredibly powerful visual demonstration of a sustained relationship in what, from an indigenous perspective, a colonial settler society, I think is a kind of milestone, a kind of cultural turn. I'm not sure yet how this work will be read in the future. But one of the things, and this of course is just to remind us about the territory and space that we're, this larger the region we're talking about, I wanted to bring in the voice of another influential Cherokee artist in my world and share with you his perspective on land, and it's the work on Phil Young, who also lives in the region that we're talking about. And when Phil and I were talking about Kay's work, correspondence through email, he sent me this little text that he'd written. Deep within the memory of the earth, a cacophony of marks competes, for a sacred place of legibility and truth. And so when I began thinking about the marks that Kay's making, I think they are seeking this kind of scraping away of this trauma, this historical trauma that marks all of the Americas, that we need in some way to reconcile. And so her farewell to the Smokies, at first, I saw it as a landscape. And then I saw it as a humanscape. And then I saw it as both a march from the past and a march into the future. And so within the discourse of Indigenous studies, there's a lot of discussion about the future. There's a discussion about the future because most of our population is under the age of 25. There's a discussion about the future because the youth in our communities are incredibly confident in their claim to indigeneity, their claim to their heritage, and their claim on the contemporary world. And so I think that when they look out into Kay's work in the future, they're going to see very different things than we see. And so I might share with you just a quick case study on what I think they may see in her work, and I'm going to base it on an example that is very close to the area that I research. And so this is the corner of Caroline Parker's skirt, a lithograph, a daguerreotype from, well, this one's in a private collection, but the photograph that is almost an iconic photograph of Haudenosaunee women. The painting on the right is another Ernest Smith, and I'm going to suggest that the painting on the painting, okay, is what we would think of in didactic terms part of a kind of landscape genre. I'm going to suggest that landscape for the Haudenosaunee or for Indigenous peoples has been inscribed in very different ways. And that the corner of this skirt is actually the conceptual mark of a relationship to place from an Indigenous perspective, in that the same narrative symbols that are envisioned or painted in the Ernest Smith are also in the beaded skirt of Caroline Parker. But because it's difficult to overcome the hierarchy of sculpture and canvas, painterly space, and to see the materiality of beads, clothing, and something that one would adorn as having an equal status, I think sometimes these things are overlooked. Yet it's still the conceptual, cosmological tree, the light or orbs of that tree, of Sky Woman coming from the upper world to this world, are still part of this design. And we can see this world as receiving her in the curvilinear shapes on the bottom and rim of the skirt that give us a wind, soil, water, and the back of the turtle, with the double curve motif perhaps as the opening from one space to the other. And so, I guess the question I have is, can we begin to have multiple ways of understanding landscape instead of just one way of looking at landscape as defined by a very Western notion that we inherit from the Renaissance that involves a particular technology of perspective? Can we open up a decolonized space to think of our relationship to place and land in multiple forms and multiple materials that are expressed by Indigenous peoples? And in this, perhaps we can look at Kay WalkingStick's work and begin to actually see both systems in play. And I say this because when we look at the parfleche, we know that in this particular parfleche, the symbols as they've been described and collected by an ethnologist, H.H. Sinclair, in 1903, from the Shoshone people, some of the ideas that are invested in the parfleche are also very similar to the ideas expressed in the land. And the interpretations, she writes, are largely geographic. In the red central triangle representing the ground, the green background trees. On this green ground is a lake, indicated by a blue area in the center. The yellow line dividing the central field is an inlet in the lake. The obtuse blue triangle on the sides of the central triangle represents mountains with timber. To me, that's a land. That's a landscape. The surface of the parfleche is a landscape. And so we have multiple landscapes. And I would just encourage us to not let go so quickly of Kay WalkingStick as an American artist. But I would advocate that I would like to think of Kay WalkingStick as an Indigenous American artist and broaden the category of what people think of as America to foreground or to privilege the idea of our presence here before America. Nyawa.